Prior to his election to the King County Superior Court, Chief Justice Gonzalez practiced both criminal and civil law. He was an assistant United States attorney in the Western District of Washington, a domestic violence prosecutor for the city of Seattle, and practiced in private practice at a Seattle law firm. Chief Justice Gonzalez will share some thoughts relevant to this evening's panel discussion before turning the podium over to our moderator for this evening's discussion, Professor Cecilia Klingel. Please join me in welcoming Chief Justice Stephen Gonzalez.
Well, thank you for the introduction and the invitation to be here. I have grown weary of hand-wringing and the expression of dismay over the disproportionality that exists in so many facets of our society. It's not enough to realize it, to recognize it, to say you feel bad about it. The only thing that will matter now is whether you actually act on what we know to be true and what we've seen so poignantly through videotaped, captured interactions, which no one can defend. My court, the Supreme Court of the state of Washington, took, in my view, an extraordinary step just over a year ago. June 4th, 2020, we issued a public letter, and I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from that letter. And I will confess that when the idea of the letter first came up, I wasn't sure that I was in favor of it. And the reason is not because I disagree with the content. The reason is that I was concerned about our ability to actually follow through on the lofty things that we say in the letter. The letter says in part, the devaluation and degradation of Black lives is not a recent event. We continue to see racialized policing and the overrepresentation of Black Americans in every stage of our criminal and juvenile justice systems. Our institutions remain affected by the vestiges of slavery, Jim Crow laws that were never dismantled, and racist court decisions that were never disavowed. The legal community must recognize that we all bear responsibility for this ongoing injustice, and that we are capable of taking steps to address it, if only we have the courage and the will. As judges, we must recognize the role we have played in devaluing Black lives. And we must also recognize that this is not how a justice system must operate. And too often in the legal profession, we feel bound by tradition and the way things have always been. The systemic oppression of Black Americans is not merely incorrect and harmful, it is shameful and it is deadly. Finally, as individuals, we must recognize that systemic racial injustice against Black Americans is not an omnipresent specter that will inevitably persist. It is the collective product of each of our individual actions, every action, every day. And we go by the title justice, and we affirm our deepest level of commitment to achieving justice by ending racism. We urge you to join us in these efforts. This is our moral imperative. So closed the letter signed by all 9 justices of the Washington Supreme Court. And so now the task of living up to those words. And to me, this is an extraordinary statement from a court recognizing that the problem exists, not denying it, admitting that we've been a part of that problem, and committing ourselves to being part of the solution and urging everyone else to join that effort, not with colorblindness, not with false claims of everything being equal now when equality isn't necessarily what we need, but rather equity. One group that responded to that call to action was the Race in the Criminal Justice System Task Force 2.0, as they've called themselves. I know something of this group since I was involved with the 1.0 version, now retrospectively named, some 11 years ago, when Professor Bob Chang of the Korematsu Center for Law and Equality here at Seattle U and I first had the idea to respond to some ignorant statements made about race and law with data, with study, with research, and with suggestions for real change. The report has just come out. I urge you to read it carefully, and to do what our letter says and what the task force says. And that is not to pat yourself on the back for now understanding the depth of the problem that we face, but committing to taking at least one small bit of that problem and doing the best that you can to eradicate it. So I commend to you again the work of the task force, which you can find at the Korematsu Center webpage. And I look forward to the discussion tonight, to our renewing our commitment to reach the lofty ideals upon which this nation was founded. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you, Justice. My name is Cecilia Klingel. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School, and it is my great pleasure and honor tonight to join on stage for interdisciplinary scholars who have dedicated their careers to advancing justice and peace, all informed in a variety of different ways by Catholic traditions and practices. Let me begin by introducing Herschella Conyers, who will be joining us remotely from the University of Chicago Law School, where she serves as the Lillian E. Kramer Clinical Professor in Public Interest Law and the Director of the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic's Criminal and Juvenile Justice Project. Before joining the law school, Herschella was an Assistant Public Defender, Supervisor, and Deputy Chief in the Office of the Cook County Public Defender. She is a native of Southside Chicago, and in that capacity became interested in criminal defense and juvenile justice after doing her law school clinical work at the Criminal Defense Consortium of Cook County and Woodlawn. She is actively engaged in criminal and juvenile justice policy at the local and national levels. She is also a faculty and board member of the National Criminal Defense College and has lectured and taught trial skills at Harvard, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers Training, the New York State Defenders Association, and numerous public defender offices and associations throughout the country. Michael J. Cox is from Seattle University and is an associate professor of theology and religious studies. His primary areas of interest in teaching are theological critiques of whiteness, ethical analysis of racial injustices, the role of emotions in ethical judgment and action, bio and medical ethics, and ethical questions regarding gender and sexuality. Professor J Cox's work has been published in numerous interdisciplinary journals addressing topics of ethics, human rights, theology, and public health. He holds a PhD in theological ethics from Boston College. To his immediate left, we have Professor Michael Scott from Arizona State University. Mike Scott is a clinical professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice and director of the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing, a research center that produces and disseminates information about how police can effectively and fairly address specific public safety problems. Professor Scott was formerly a clinical professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School. Sorry, we lost him, and has previously worked in the administration previously worked in the as an administrator in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, St. Louis, Missouri, and Fort Pierce, Florida, and the New York City Police Departments, where he was also a police officer in Madison, Wisconsin. He is a former senior researcher at the Police Executive Research Forum in Washington, D.C., and has authored numerous guides for police officers and agencies and articles on topics related to criminal justice administration. And finally, to his immediate left is Tobias Winright of St. Louis University. He is an associate professor of healthcare ethics and theology and teaches courses on Catholic healthcare ethics, healthcare in the Catholic tradition, and methods in religious ethics. He is a former corrections officer and former police officer, and often writes and speaks on topics related to just policing. He recently published the book Serve and Protect, Selected Essays on Just Policing. He is a prolific writer, and his work has been published in numerous interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary journals. And so it is with great pleasure that I turn over the stage first to Professor Conyers.
Good evening, everyone. I am so happy to be in this company, even remotely. Let me start by just saying we were given a short time to make our sort of opening remarks. Justice Gonzalez said what I had to say, so maybe it bears repeating. So I have practiced criminal defense since the 80s, and through those years, I have lawyered through the war on drugs. I have lawyered through the war on crime. I have lawyered through the super predator era. And one of the reasons I am glad to be here tonight and to engage in this conversation is that we must look at our language. We must look at the framing of the issues, because I had never considered myself a soldier. I had never considered myself trained in war tactics. I do criminal defense out of a belief, again, as the justice alluded to, that the least of these require as the best from the rest of us. And that is the framework within which I have practiced all these years. So let me start by saying this. The slogan, the motto of the Chicago Police Department, we are known as the false confession capital of the world, but that's not what's on the police cars. What's on the police cars is the motto to serve and protect. And if we can get there, that's what I hope we are striving to do. What an extraordinary thing to have on your car every day. Unfortunately, that's not where we are. And while I'm going to focus on the police, I do, again, just want to echo, we are all implicated. As a defense lawyer, as prosecutors, as judges, as sheriffs, we are all implicated in what is an unjust criminal justice system. So I want to talk about two things. One, we get the police we deserve. And we get the police we deserve this way. We talk about the police in the community. Well, the police are not, although they may be seen in some neighborhoods as occupying forces, they are not. They are related to people. They're related to me. They are related to you. They are our fathers, our sons, our brothers, our husbands, our wives, our children. So it's not the police that we can talk about without talking about ourselves as well, because they come home to somebody. They go to Thanksgiving dinner or have Thanksgiving dinner for somebody. They celebrate Christmas the way most Christians do. And if not, they celebrate other religious holidays. So we should be very thoughtful when we are talking about the police, because as I say, we get the police that we deserve and the police that we reinforce in lots of ways. So the other thing I'm asking people to keep in mind as we go through the evening is this false dichotomy between perpetrators and victims and good guys and bad guys. Many of my clients were victims before they were perpetrators and were victims after they were perpetrators. It's not an either or proposition in the communities that I serve. They are celebrating, if you will, in the last 15 years or so, death anniversary parties. Teenagers should not have to go to death anniversary parties, but that's what they are celebrating. So victim and perpetrators, that's very porous. Good guys and bad guys, most of us could go in one or the other category, depending on what day you came across us. But let's talk about the police. So the police are critical decision makers and line drawers in these ways. They are the initial professional assessors of harm and crime and liability. If they don't see a crime, it's not a crime. If they don't see conduct as a crime, it's not a crime. So that they are the first responders to making a legal decision about something that then puts the entire legal criminal justice system into motion. They are also the decision makers that are about what force is necessary in carrying out what their beliefs are about who is wrong, who has been harmed. And they get to decide, sometimes spontaneously, about what the necessary force is to apprehend someone. They become then the professional. And this is critically important, again, for all of us in the field. They become the professional and presumptively unimpeachable witness at trials. So they carry an extraordinary amount of weight in this system. In Chicago, as you know, we have had problems with the police in community for several years now. But it has not been, and I think in looking at the past history of racism and the war, the war on poverty, that's another war I lived through. And let me say just one thing about wars. Can't have wars without soldiers, can't have wars without casualties. And so the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on crime has decimated my communities. So what do we want to do about this? And in 2016, I was part of then Mayor Rahm Emanuel's Police Accountability Task Force. And we are presently in Chicago under a consent decree. We have not gotten far. And in some ways, the community feeling about the police and the community's perceived perception of the police has never been lower than it is. It really feels, if you watch the news in Chicago, as if it's crazy. The current police chief suggested just last week that what we should do is lock them all up and we'll figure out the evidence later and let somebody sift it out, when it gets to the state's attorney's office. I would like to think that that's not what he was trying to say, but that was what he was trying to say. And that's pretty scary to me for a sworn officer. So what's right? What should we be doing? And I'm going to end on this because I am anxious to hear from everybody else. I think we should be doing several things. And the things I want to talk about are in community policing. That's one word, in-community policing, and therapeutic policing. And they overlap. And let me say this before I get into what the structures of that might look like. When I talked about harm and trauma, I also want to acknowledge, as we should, because it goes to, I think, better training, that the police officers are not immune from trauma. They experience a great deal of trauma in their work, and that a healthy police force and a healthy community that supports that police department, because again, the use of police force is a little militaristic, appreciates that, and you don't lose points, you don't lose promotions, you don't, rise in the ranks of police officers because you are strong enough and have the courage enough to say, I need some help. I need to talk to someone. I need to learn, coping mechanisms, better coping mechanisms. Because again, just as my communities are sometimes overwhelmed with drugs and alcohol and health problems, the Chicago Police Department is not far behind. And I think there are other police departments that also have disproportionate numbers of, I say this thoughtfully, of victims, working victims who are there. So again, I think we've got to keep everybody in mind. So what's my vision of in-community policing? It is a vision of a safe space, a public space where regularly police personnel and community come together to talk. It is a space where, and this would probably, I think, require legislation here, but that all arms, all guns be placed securely. I think Chicago police officers are required to be armed at all times. But if we really, this is a radical reconsideration. So I'm putting it out there. But where, Saturday morning, there will be officers present, there will be community present, and that we will talk about what the issues in the community are. And that we will see police officers in some other context than I should probably turn and go the other way, which is too often a response in my community. And it is a response that I myself have engaged in. I try not to be where the police are. So in that, what we need then is to show people, our community and ourselves and our families, how there are officers who can be trusted. And I'm talking about something more than just maybe 20, 30 years ago, Chicago started an officer-friendly program in the schools. And that grew into having police officers in the schools. Last year, I was on a committee about the Chicago police officers in the schools, and the overwhelming, it was a community group of people from very CPS, Chicago Public Schools, different areas, public sector people. And overwhelmingly, the recommendation was to get the police out of the schools because they were not properly trained to deal with what, if you have raised a child or if you are raising an adolescent, you know how they can just go off the deep end so quickly. But it was the consensus of this group that the police escalated this as opposed to learning how to de-escalate. So that's all for me part of therapeutic and in-community policing, is to reward de-escalation tactics over hits, if you will. A serious openness to police misconduct records. There are people, and I am one of them, who could, name the top 10 offenders in the last 30 years. And every time I checked back in, they had gotten promoted. So let me end with this. I don't know who first said it, but it has lingered with me. And I think we should think about this as we continue our work. And it's the phrase, if you keep your foot on my neck, neither one of us can move. And I think we saw that stunningly portrayed with Derek Chauvin and George Floyd. And again, it is a tragic case because Derek Chauvin has become part of the people that I have taken an oath to protect constitutionally and with the law and to defend. And his life will never be the same. And of course, George Floyd is dead. So I think that we've got to think more broadly, but if we continue to play this, I will keep you down game, we will all be kept down. That's it, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Good evening, everyone. I know that each of us only has a short amount of time to speak, and so I'll get right to the point. Since this event intends to be a radical reconsideration of public safety, I'd like to propose that US society is too reliant upon the policing system as the guarantor of public safety. This framing of the problem in terms of reliance, I'm borrowing from the attorney and organizer, Derica Purnell. The main cause of this reliance lies in the fact that our society has also been unable to muster the political will to address our deep social inequalities. And so we fall back on the policing system to manage this unequal society. So holding these things in mind, I'm going to propose tonight that an abolitionist framing of our response to the policing system is the most consistent with Catholic theological and ethical commitments to the common good, justice, and peace. My friend and colleague, Professor Winright, sitting to my far left, and I have been having an academic and a personal discussion about the policing system since at least 2015. But for just over a year now, since the events of summer 2020, including the protests in response to Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd, we have been having a more specific discussion about the compatibility of police abolition with Catholic theology. And this has resulted in some very robust yet also charitable disagreement on this question. So first, I'd like to think about where he and I share some common ground in terms of our theological and ethical values and principles. And after doing that, I'm going to try to account for how and why we diverge. It also goes without saying that he and I share a commitment to justice. And this takes shape in our support of political efforts to remedy the structural causes of ongoing racial injustices in US society. The moral evil of racism is a deeply ingrained threat to public safety, public health, and democratic governance. Professor Winright and I agree that it has contributed to the cultural socialization and behavior of police officers, as well as the broader institutional culture and patterns of operation of the policing system, more broadly speaking. It's also clear that he and I agree that the status quo of the policing system in the United States inflicts serious, multifaceted, and intergenerational forms of harm on individuals and communities. So we share an ethical commitment to reducing this social harm as much as possible. We also clearly share a reverence for the dignity of all human persons as created in the image of God. And we also seek to promote and protect the common good, understood as the social conditions that will enable each person to flourish and be treated justly and fairly by the society of which they are a member. Finally, Professor Winright and I share a deep awareness of the many ways that society routinely violates the human rights of those who find themselves in the position of having less social power. And so we agree that the current institutional arrangements of society are subject to critique and revision in light of the experiences of those on the receiving end of oppressive systems. So that being said, in terms of shared values and principles, the sources, I think, of our divergence on the question of how to respond to the problems of the policing system also deserve some attention. A central aspect of Professor Winright's scholarship on the policing system is that he defines the function of the police in terms of, quote, being able to intervene, possibly with the use of force, because there's a persistent social need to resolve social conflict on this side of the final eschaton, is how he put it. So addressing this particular human social need, in his view, is a necessary condition for ensuring the common good, which is the prerogative of the state, according to Catholic tradition. Therefore, Catholics should regard policing as a necessary yet regrettable system, as part of the morally justifiable operation of the state. But I'd like to ask, how should an ethicist determine the function of a social institution? Is the function of an institution a way of speaking about the ethical standard that we hold it to? Or is the function of an institution a way of speaking about how human beings exercise social power through that institution? So when Professor Winright defines the function of the policing system in terms of intervention, using force if necessary, as a prerogative of the state in order to ensure the protection of the common good, he's using more the first methodology. I would like to use a different ethical methodology. So borrowing from the work of a sociologist, Eric Vitale, and a political scientist, David Bailey, my claim is that the function of the policing system is to manage the effects of social inequality by managing the bodies of those who are at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Now, Professor Winright and I would agree that the well-being of those at the bottom of any society's social hierarchy is the best measure of how well that society recognizes human dignity and protects and ensures the common good. We would also agree that the state is the entity morally responsible for guaranteeing these social conditions, mostly because it has the capacity to do it by democratic means. But I do not regard the policing system as a necessary component of the state, precisely because the function of the policing system to manage the effects of social inequality actually undermines the state's ability to preserve the common good. Policing is what you might call an enabling institution. It enables our civic unwillingness to remedy the root structural causes of our outrageous degree of social inequality. And we rely on it to manage the fallout. But I don't want to stop by claiming that the policing system actually undermines the state in its ability to ensure the common good. Policing is also, I'd like to claim, a fairly historically recent and contingent social institution. By saying this, I mean that the policing system, and I know that Professor Winright knows this, emerged in a specific historical and economic context, the age of laissez-faire capitalism. And that this history shows us that it has never been a public entity staffed by civil servants, guided by politically and economically disinterested imperatives in service to the public good. He and I share an interest in the history of policing, but our different understandings of the function of the policing system shape our different interpretations of the history, I think. So he notes in his own scholarship that the social peacekeeping approach to policing, which aimed to maintain the peace in a conflictual urban environment with minimal use of non-lethal force, was a kind of social experiment in its original location in London in 1829. It was then imported to Boston in 1838, New York in 1844, Chicago in 1855, and so on. Professor Winright also argues that the more sort of militarized or crime fighter approach to policing, in which force is not used as a last resort, but routinely as a means of social control, owes its genealogy more to the slave patrols of the US South in the antebellum period and the policing methods that were used to enforce Jim Crow after Reconstruction. With this framing of history in mind, it makes sense to say that the goal should be to get all police departments to better resemble the London model, to employ only minimal use of force as necessary for morally legitimate purposes, and to get the departments there by means of reform. But from a sociological perspective, this has never been the function of the policing system. And there is not very much difference between these two models at all. There is a consistent historical pattern in both cases by which the policing system maintained the social hierarchy and managed the effects of unaddressed social inequality. So in northern urban settings, Vitale, the sociologist I mentioned a minute ago, he notes that the main functions of these new police, despite their claims at the time of political neutrality, were to protect property, quell riots, put down strikes and other industrial actions, and produce a disciplined industrial workforce. Labor organizations were infiltrated by police, labor organizers were surveilled and even preemptively jailed. The historian Sally Haddon argues that in the southern, more often rural settings, what the slave patrols did for the old economic system of slavery, eventually the Jim Crow police did for the new economic system of sharecropping and convict labor. The police ensured the protection of the property rights and economic interests of the white elite class by managing the bodies of free Black people and severely restricting the economic options available. The sociological interpretation of that history, of how the policing system has actually functioned, is a large part of why I am skeptical about reform, about the likelihood that reform efforts will produce the outcome of restoring the US policing system to a better version of itself. Where is there a historical example of this? An additional thread running through this corrupt 19th century and 20th century policing systems prior to the professionalization of the 1970s is that the police were empowered to maintain the social hierarchy by reference to a socially constructed idea of criminality and the perception that police enforcement of criminal law is generally a morally legitimate aim. But criminal law often functions as the tool of the most powerful social classes, enabling them to create a new social reality in which an activity that disrupts the economic system, or even an activity that's necessary for those at the bottom of the social hierarchy to survive, has now become a criminal activity. For example, the legal scholar Michelle Alexander has analyzed at length the racialized dimensions of the war on drugs and the 1994 Clinton crime bill, which have become textbook examples of the social construction of crime. Having determined which activities and which persons count as criminal, society authorizes the policing system to employ a spectrum of techniques, which do include arrest, the use of force, and the implied threat of the use of force, but which also include various technological and non-technological means of surveillance, as well as the more subtle efforts of psychological conditioning via mass media that encourage the population to defer to the authority of the police. So to wrap up, my abolitionist proposal is not merely that this social institution of policing is invariably corrupt or beyond the possibility of effective reform. To claim that would almost be too timid. So my proposal hits deeper. It might well be sociologically impossible, or at least very difficult, to abolish the policing system if we are not also concurrently taking drastic steps to remedy social inequality through state intervention and robust political engagement. Our society has become reliant upon the policing system to a dangerous degree, such that this system is continually able to persuade even more liberal voting constituencies, like Seattle, for example, that the police need more funding in order to do less harm to society, despite the fact that more funding actually in practice ensures the policing system will have more social power and more effective means of managing the effects of social inequality. We are not going to be able to temper or eliminate this societal reliance upon the policing system or to reduce its social power overnight. Everyone knows the change, if it happens, will be incremental. But I'm proposing we should frame this political response as abolition, This must be the long-term social goal, and abolitionist criteria for action must serve this goal. So I would like to end by proposing 3 basic abolitionist criteria for guiding action. And here I am again borrowing some ideas from Purnell. 1, when considering any reform proposal regarding the training or type of work to be given to a police department, or regarding the technology or procedures that the police use, ask whether this reform includes allocating more, less, or the same amount of public funds to the policing system. More money in the hands of the policing system translates into more social power that that system can now exercise. Criteria 2, advocate for the reallocation of public funds that are currently directed to the policing system toward different social institutions and services that already clearly ensure the social conditions of the common good, support human dignity, and reduce social inequality, such as public education, affordable housing, access to health care, social workers, mental health clinicians, addiction specialists, and community-based approaches to resolving conflict. And criterion 3, advocate for the decriminalization of activities that do no serious harm, such as the possession or sale of small amounts of marijuana, and for a separate, unarmed public system for handling low-level crimes, such as most traffic violations. This will reduce the total number of points of contact between the policing system and the public, which will, in turn, reduce the total amount of arrests and suspect deaths while in police custody, as well as the total number of court cases, felony convictions, prisoners, people on parole, and people who are permanently and legally disenfranchised. Thank you.
When asked to join this project and write a chapter on the police, it occurred to me that I had spent over 40 years, my entire career, thinking about, writing about, teaching about, and to Chief Justice's point, implementing various police reforms. That's really what my entire career has been focused on. And I've spent my entire life as a practicing Catholic. But prior to this project, I confess that I had never really given serious thought to what connection there might be between the two. And so this has really been an interesting exercise for me in reflecting on whether or not, or how the Catholic doctrine and Catholic teaching would view the sorts of reforms that I've been advocating for all these decades. I do appreciate the title of this panel, that it's a radical reconsideration of public safety. I like considering things radically. I think there's something inherently productive about doing that. I'm less optimistic that the actual implementation of reform, in criminal justice reform in the United States, will be as radical as we might hope. And largely that's because we don't have a single criminal justice system in the United States. We have generously 3,000 plus, with each county operating within 50 states, plus the districts and territories, having different bodies of law. And so over 3,000 different prosecutors and judicial court systems, and 18,000 some police agencies. We simply are not a nation equipped for radical reform across the board. So a criminal justice reform, I think, it's more of a constant evolution than a series of revolutions. Now, arguably, I would say that police reform has been more dramatic historically in the United States than has prosecutorial, judicial, or corrections reform. And largely because the police are the most visible agents of this system. One never sees really political public protests and demonstrations against prosecutors and against in favor of prison reform or judicial reform. So our focus has really been on the police, and the police have had to respond to that public pressure more so than have other actors within the criminal justice system. The central argument that I and my colleague Cecilia Klingel and our UW Law School colleague Walter Dickey, we published a law review article about 10 years ago now titled Reimagining Criminal Justice. And among the central arguments that we made in that is that we have come to believe, the three of us, that the criminal justice system, at least as it is currently constituted, is largely less effective, less efficient, and less equitable than many people imagine it to be who have not had personal experience with it, and certainly less so than we would hope it to be. And in particular, I do think that the police, often viewed as being at the front end of this criminal justice system, have unfortunately relied too much on the criminal justice system as the mechanism by which it was going to process its business, to handle the things that are asked of the police. Too much of that has been fed into the criminal justice system for further processing. And it turns out that the criminal justice system really is poorly suited for handling a lot of the business that comes to the police. And so to the extent that police make use of the criminal justice system, arresting offenders to address problems such as drug and alcohol abuse, or mentally ill offending, or suicide prevention, or even low-level disorder control, forcing that business into the criminal justice system often takes it into a system that really is not prepared, not equipped to handle that kind of business. But it is worse than that. It distorts, it leads the police to distort their arrest powers and the use of legal means to get people into the system in the hopes that something good will come of it. Now, it may be that the police historically have either lacked or have been excessively reluctant to use alternative responses to these public disorder, public safety problems. But it really is this desire to seek out and to get the police to use alternatives to the criminal justice system as a means of achieving their legitimate objectives that really fostered this movement in police reform that began actually at the University of Wisconsin Law School in the 1970s, was articulated as a problem-oriented approach to policing by our former colleague, Professor Herman Goldstein at the Wisconsin Law School in 1979. So this problem-oriented approach to policing, in summary, it encourages the police to not only think of their business as handling these particular complaints or incidents or crimes. As important as that is, we want the police to also begin to recognize the similarities between and among many of these incidents, these crimes, these cases, to recognize that there's often a common denominator. There's some common cause as to why these incidents are arising. And for the police to then begin to package and conceptualize their work as not simply handling one incident after another, but to package them as what we would call problems that are begging for some deeper kind of attention. And the approach really calls for the police to try to better understand the underlying causes and the contributing factors that are giving rise to those crimes and those incidents and those complaints. Now, we're not talking really about what some people call the root causes of crime, things like poverty and racism and psychopathology and substance abuse. These are critically important factors, but they tend to be the kinds of things that the police really can't do much about themselves, nor do we really want them to try. So we're really getting the police to think about the more immediate causes, the more immediate contributing factors that are giving rise to people needing to call the police. The approach really encourages the police to emphasize prevention of harm and not simply the reaction to it and the remediation of it after the harm has been done. It again calls for the police to not rule out the use of the criminal justice system, but to constantly seek alternatives to its use. Always be asking, is there another way? Is there a better way to address this particular problem without invoking the criminal process? And critically important to this approach is really that the police would search for, come up with a variety of different possibilities for responding to these problems, but prior to implementing them, would solicit input from the community, from affected parties, from other actors whose support would be needed to carry them out, and carefully consider both the intended and try to anticipate unintended consequences of that particular plan of action. The approach also emphasizes very strongly what we call the shifting and the sharing of responsibility by the police, shifting it and sharing it with other government agencies, with non-government organizations, with community individuals or community groups, with the business communities, with those who are affected by the problem. Because again, when we leave the solution to all of these problems in the hands of the police, we often get results that we don't want, which emphasize the use of the criminal arrest and prosecution process. The approach then calls for constantly assessing, once these new approaches have been implemented to address a problem, constantly assessing what impact that's had on the particular problem. And then sharing that knowledge, documenting it and sharing it with other professionals, with other police agencies, so that we can systematically learn across the policing profession and the crime prevention professions what seems to work better than other approaches, and what are the known consequences of crime in various ways. So while there have been a few modest efforts to apply this problem-oriented framework to the fields of corrections and prosecution and the courts, it has taken much deeper root in the police field, although there's still much more work to be done. Now, as I think about what Catholic doctrine might have to say about this, three Catholic doctrinal precepts seem to me to support and maybe even compel this approach to policing and to public safety. The first is, borrowing from the Catholic doctrine relating to the death penalty, is the principle of employing the least amount of coercive force necessary to achieve legitimate public safety objectives. The second is the principle in Catholic doctrine of respect for scientific knowledge. And the third of the twin principles of mercy and care for the afflicted. Now, when I combine these three precepts, I conclude that they have some fairly substantial implications for the police, among which are not to seek punishment when care is called for, not to seek harsher punishment than is necessary to keep society safe, to again employ the least coercive methods necessary, and to consult scientific knowledge about effective crime and disorder prevention. And as that body of knowledge grows and it provides police with effective non-punitive responses, I feel that the police increasingly become morally obligated to heed that knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Why am I here? Who am I? I was introduced, I know, but I have not always been a theologian, a Catholic ethicist. I am the first person in my family to go to college. I always wanted to go to college. And my family were farmers, factory workers. And when my parents divorced, my mom became a police officer back in the 1970s in Florida. When I was ready to graduate high school, I wanted to go to college so much, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't have much help. So I started off at a community college, and I later transferred to a state university down in Florida. While I did those 4 years, I worked full-time, mostly midnight shift, as a correctional officer for a large metropolitan sheriff's department. Later on, I also did some patrol. While I was on that job, initially in the 1980s, I witnessed so many things. I experienced so many things. I still have some scars from those days. I saw a lot of racist police brutality. I saw a lot of economic disparity and injustice. And I asked a lot of questions, especially during the day while I was in my classes, and I was exposed to Catholic teaching, Gaudium et Spes, reading the signs of the times. And I started thinking about the use of force a little bit more deeply as a practicing Catholic. How do I reconcile that with my faith? I knew that Gaudium et Spes says that we cannot separate what we do at worship and our faith from our daily lives. It said that that separation is one of the serious errors of this age. So I wanted to try to have integrity. I was a young person, late teens, early 20s, and I didn't know where to turn to try to find help with these kinds of questions. After I graduated, I resigned from that job, and I was able to go to graduate school instead of law school, which was my original plan. And I studied theology and ethics for several years, especially as they pertain to this question. After all, during those 80s was that war on drugs, war on crime. In 1991, we had Rodney King in Los Angeles. I saw many people with mental health problems turned away during the 1980s from their institutions and then warehoused in jails and prisons. And I was tired of feeling like I was just addressing the symptoms, and I wanted to study the causes and maybe contribute something that would lead to greater justice for the common good. Serve and protect? Yes, that's a motto. Actually, in Genesis, where it says God placed the human one, Adam, in the garden to till and keep the garden, in the Hebrew, that could be translated best as to serve and protect the garden, the planet, to be carers for our common home, as Pope Francis says. So I became an ethicist. Ethicists ask, what ought we do? We also ask, who ought we be? What kind of people are we? What is our identity? And we should also ask, what is going on? The signs of the times, as I said. So we need to read the history. We need to study the sociology. We need to study the criminology. We need to also, I would say, study anthropology. So after all, as my friend Michael J Cox pointed out, one of the words I use is the police function. I think it'd be better to call it the function of providing public safety. That's something that I think crosses cultural boundaries. Every culture, every society has had someone who responds and tries to prevent harm to others in the community. whether that's the institution that we now call the police, that doesn't mean as much to me anymore. That's not as significant because they have been called other things. They have been called other things. So when I went to Notre Dame to do my PhD and write my dissertation on this during the 1990s on the challenge of policing and analysis in Christian social ethics, I discovered that from a Catholic perspective, the police have been a lacuna. They have not been studied. The Catholic tradition has devoted much ink to questions of violence and peacemaking, just war theory, for example. With regard to criminal justice, the Catholic tradition has focused on prisons, incarceration, penitentiaries, and the death penalty. A lot of police officers I know, especially in this country, are Catholic. They are us, too, like my own mother and myself. And there are few, if any, resources that have been devoted to providing them guidance for how to do their service to the community in ways that are consonant with their identity as Catholics, as well as fellow citizens and human beings. I do think this is an opportunity for us to contribute something that may be helpful to the ongoing discussion at this time. Michael mentioned my work on Sir Robert Peel in 1829. Yes, there's a lot more to the story. It's complicated. There were economic factors involved, but he was intentional in creating a police to provide public safety that was an alternative to the military. The military was responding to riots and whatnot, and swords and guns were used. The police that Peel started were unarmed. They were citizens. They were in the community, of the community, and from the community. They did other things like make sure the lights are lit, putting out fires. Actually, this function earlier was done by constables, night watchmen, even going back to ancient times, Rome and Greece. There was always somebody that did public safety in these ways, even crying out the weather and the hours, finding lost people, helping those in need, including those on the bottom. Peel was intentional about that. And yes, when it was transported to the United States, both in the North and the South, there were a lot of elements that went into it that transformed it. But even here at first, our police were not armed either. It wasn't until much later, especially early 20th century, that the police in this country became more and more armed, as Herschella sort of said, mirroring what was going on in this society. As the society became more and more armed and more guns were circulating in this country. So there's much going on here that we need to take into account of. I call for reform, and I think it actually has a lot of common ground with what Michael J. Cox was saying, as well as encompassing some of the elements such as problem-solving policing that Michael Scott has shared with us. In Jeremiah 29:7, it says, "Seek the peace of the city." We Catholics, we are disciples of the Prince of Peace. Now, peace is not just the absence of conflict. It is shalom. It is, as the title says, justice and peace together. Pope Paul VI, if you want peace, work for justice. Now, they're not going to be in complete harmony until the kingdom comes in its fullness. So in the meantime, there still must be, unfortunately, someone designated who will intervene to serve and protect. Given our commitment to peace, they should use force only as a last resort and only minimally. I like how they call them in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and my Irish, I cannot speak it, but Garda Síochána, guardians of the peace. In the United States here, sometimes we call them peace officers. I think that would be good to retrieve that. John Paul II, Saint Pope John Paul II, in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, he used a phrase with regard to healthcare professionals, guardians and servants of human life. I think that gets at what we're looking for everyone who has a responsibility to public safety and the common good, but especially for those who are authorized either at the local level or the state level to use force if necessary. To go even outside of Catholicism, Gandhi, the well-known advocate of nonviolence, he wrote, even a government based primarily on nonviolence will still need a small police force when necessary. He added that there will be servants, not masters of the people. They will employ mutual cooperation. And he actually used the word, the police will be reformers. So for me, reform leads to other R's. Reallocate. I agree with that, what Michael J Cox said and advocated. Defund, reallocate. In partnership with others, there's many others. As I said earlier, police used to do so many things, put out fires and things like that. Now we have fire departments. Police used to do many other things that we now designate to others. In the last 40 years, as Alex Vitale in his The End of Policing book from 2017 said, the police in the last 40 years, their scope of responsibilities have expanded more than ever. They are the hammer and everything's a nail. And that's not how it should be. We should reallocate, we should reimagine, and we should reframe that change of language. The war metaphor, the police. Sociologists show us many models of policing. There's the military model. That's become dominant in this country. Radley Balco's book on that is excellent. That has become the dominant mode. But there are other models that we can try. And that metaphor, though, Jim Childress in Healthcare Ethics once on bioethics, he said, even with war on cancer, the war metaphor in medicine, that's a metaphor that we use, but over time, that metaphor uses us. It dictates to us how we see things and address them. So we need to pay attention to our language. So what I call for still is not just policing, but truly just policing. Call it what you want. Thank you.
Thanks to you all for those comments. I wish we had many hours in which to discuss them tonight, but I think we have time for just really probably one question, and I'll make it this. You talked tonight about how the radical visions that you articulated for us may not be fully realizable, and yet I wonder what it is that you have seen in your practice, in the work that you do, that gives you the greatest hope that we will change. What do you see happening today that best reflects at least some aspects of the kinds of change that you are encouraging here tonight that promotes justice and advances peace?
I can't hear Cecilia.
Nations as well. I really have come to believe that properly led, properly guided, properly equipped and supported, most police officers want to do good, want to do well, and will do what is asked of them. And so when we do ask them to behave in ways in which they really are serving as caretakers of the community, providing more assistance than punishment. They do tend to respond to that, both young officers and experienced officers alike. Most police officers, they don't like being resented by a community. They don't really like being feared. They want to be appreciated and they want to do good. And so I lay a lot of the responsibility at the feet of police leaders, who of course are answerable to political leaders. And so I do see a great deal of hope with the right leadership.
I would affirm what Michael Scott just said about other countries, other cities. I mean, there's a variety of kinds of policing done in this United States. So there's been city police departments in Newark, Trenton, that have really changed. And it has a lot to do with that identity, mission, and values, and partnering with the community. And I think there is a receptivity to it, and that is something we should pay attention to. And it might not be a cookie cut thing that can be implemented exactly the same everywhere, but there's a lot percolating right now, and it gives me hope. Where I live right now, I live downtown St. Louis, my family. I hear gunfire every week. I jog every day downtown. I know street people by name, they know me. I see a lot of people who are victims, and they are the people on the bottom. And they want somebody who will be there for them, to serve and protect them too. I've gotten to know local law enforcement officers, especially from the sheriff's department, the city sheriff's department, and they desire what Michael Scott just said. Divorce rate is high, suicide rate is high. The trauma that Herschella mentioned earlier, there's a term now circulating called moral injury with regard to soldiers, you know, when they experience bad things in combat and what it does to them. Not only negative effects out there in the world, but it has an effect on them. In Catholic teaching, we call that the intransitive effect on a person. Their actions don't actually have an effect out there, but it also has an effect on who they are, their very being. And so I think that part of the reform that we're talking about here definitely needs to expand its scope to try to help facilitate this sort of reform, this change, and it would be radical.
I'd like to speak cautiously, but about hope. But the thing that perhaps inspires hope in me is related to some of my time doing observer participant research among grassroots organizing communities in St. Louis, which is part of how I got to know Professor Winright. Persons I met there were college students, persons in their 20s, responding with righteous anger to the murder of Michael Brown Jr. and the continued lack of accountability on the part of local police departments and the whole criminal justice system. And I mean, I saw them trying to get the tear gas out of their eyes and trying to figure out what to do when you get shot by a rubber bullet and that kind of thing. But many of them were able to work through that trauma, and you know what they do now? They're running for public office and winning. They're going to law school. They're getting PhDs. They're owning their own businesses. And that's what gives me hope.
I think what gives me hope is that.
Herschella, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, it says I'm not. How's that?
Better.
All right. The thing that gives me hope is what everybody has said, But also what gives me hope is the sustained interest in this. Again, I've been at this a long time, and there have not been a lot of panels. Okay, it's Rodney King, it's George Floyd, it's Laquan McDonald, and that doesn't count those who were not killed. And it's a blip on the news, and then we go on about our business. So I am hopeful with, again, the surge of a new generation of young people who are willing to keep the fire burning. But I am heartened mostly by the willingness of old heads to be willing to take a look at ourselves and to be guided and to listen to what the next generation is telling us, because in addition to all of the places that these people are going that have been mentioned, they're also going to become police officers. And I hope out of that radical bunch, some will become police officers.
Question if you talk really fast. So here we go. If you had one wish, hope, prayer granted and could make one change, and only one, in the way police engage with their communities today, what would that one change be?
That's an interesting question.
For me, the militarization is one thing I would change right away. The way they look right away when their presence is made there, even on our campuses, many campuses I've been to look more like soldiers than they do servants and protectors.
Yeah, I think I would, one of the most profound learning experiences for me in my police academy was my academy sent me for a week to spend in, not overnight, but all day at an alcoholics rehabilitation halfway house. I sat among this group of alcoholics and attended their meetings and listened to them and talked to them. And it's those experiences, not just in a training context, but in an everyday context. If we ask our police officers, give them the time and expect of them that they get out, meet people as individuals, get to know who they're policing, especially the people that are not really eager to meet them, to humanize the occupation. I think that goes an awful long way towards humanizing the policing.
Yeah, I think, something.
Herschella, were you saying something?
Yeah, oh, no, I'm sorry. I was saying that I think something, and I forget who just said it, but even with the rioters, so it is take out the use of force. If we can disrupt rioters with rubber bullets, we can disrupt robbers with rubber bullets, it seems to me. And I would certainly echo, again, they must be in community as people, not as an invading army. So that's it for me.
Michael, you get the final word.
Briefly in my remarks, and I want to echo some of the strategies for harm reduction that my colleagues have proposed, and in the general spirit of not giving to the police jobs that they don't need to be doing. Simple things like, for example, like not using tear gas in a residential neighborhood. That's a violation of international law, for one thing, but we routinely do it in the United States. But even at the more mundane level, like But we don't actually need to use the policing system to pull people over for low-level crimes like traffic violations, for example. Like if you get a speeding ticket in Canada, it's not the police who give you the speeding ticket. They don't have a gun. It's like a different public institution in that country. There's no reason why we can't do it that way here. And it also would preemptively de-escalate the possibility of violence. If the person in the car knows that the person pulling them over to give them a ticket doesn't have the gun, you've already set up a situation in which there's a much lower level of the possibility of escalation. So just a couple of things.
Thank you very much. And will you all please join me in thanking our panel for tonight?